Hello, I'm Professor John Blakeman from the University of Wisconsin at Stevens Point Political Science Department, and I'd like to welcome you to this lecture series on the U.S. Constitution, sponsored by the University of Wisconsin Stevens Point Alumni Association and their Alumni College Experience. So over the course of this lecture series, there will be 14 lectures total. We will cover a wide range of constitutional issues and cases, from constitutional interpretation to cases on congressional power, presidential power, and the First Amendment free speech clause. And along the way, I hope you'll come to a better understanding of the U.S. Constitution than you might already have, perhaps. And if anything, I hope you'll come away with a good understanding about how I teach this subject to students here at UW-Stevens Point. So this introductory lecture, we'll get underway in just a second. It's basically, it'll give you a broad overview of the lecture series and a little more detail about the topics that we'll cover. And it also gives you a sort of an introduction to the content of the U.S. constitutional law class that I typically teach. Now, all of the lectures that follow were recorded over the span of a couple of months. And I'm recording introductions to those lectures. So I apologize for the disjointed video editing. I'll admit, I'm not the best video editor out there, but I'll get better as we go along. Okay, so let's get underway. Now, in my class on campus, Poly 330, I thought it might help if you had a good sense of the course objectives and what the course was like. Now, we're not going to go through the entire course, so don't worry about that, okay? But it might give you an idea about how I approach the subject matter. And so in this course, it's a 300-level course, so it typically enrolls third and fourth year students, many of whom are political science majors, a lot of whom are not. But we focus on a lot of different things. We focus on the United States Supreme Court. We focus on the Constitution. We focus on how the Supreme Court interprets the Constitution. And we also look at other political branches like Congress and the presidency and the states and the role that they play in American constitutional law. And so some of the learning outcomes that we have, students learn to read and analyze closely constitutional law cases decided by the U.S. Supreme Court. They study the court's decisions to learn and understand and explain how American constitutional law develops and changes over time. And then they read Supreme Court cases on the Constitution to learn how the Constitution guides and affects American public policy. So the way this alumni college experience course is going to work, there will be several lectures. The introductory lectures will be relatively short, hopefully. And then I'm going to present several more in-depth lectures on very specific Supreme Court cases. And I'll list those for you in just a minute. But one of the lectures will be on what I call constitutional politics. And another lecture will be on a constitutional roadmap, just a very basic introduction to the U.S. Constitution. Then I'll briefly go over constitutional interpretation, the various ways we interpret the document. I'll have a very short lecture segment on how to read Supreme Court cases, and then we will get into some of the specific cases in a lot more detail. Now, some of those cases we'll talk about. So we'll start with cases on congressional power, and we will start with a very famous case that you all have heard of, Marbury versus Madison, decided in the early 1800s. And this is the case where the Supreme Court declares that it has the power of judicial review. We will follow that with a case, McCulloch versus Maryland, which, again, in the early 1800s, 1819, I think, which concerns the constitutionality of the National Bank of the United States. And if you're familiar with the musical Hamilton at all, which I haven't seen, I'll admit, unfortunately, because I'd love to see it. An early part of the musical deals with the debate over this very issue. Then we'll talk about another case early again in our history, Gibbons versus Ogden, which concerns steamboats on the Hudson River and who gets to regulate them, the federal government or the state of New York. And then we will end the section on congressional power looking at a very famous New Deal court case, NLRB versus Jones and Laughlin Steel. Then we'll shift to look at presidential power, and we will look at two cases that come out of the Civil War era, the prize cases and ex parte Merriman, both of which present a couple of constitutional dilemmas for us and give us several questions to think about, one of which is, what is the authority of the President of the United States in times of national crisis? And then we'll skip to the mid-20th century, 1950s, with a very famous case, Youngstown Sheet and Tube versus Sawyer, where again, we have a national crisis and we look at how our president responds to that, and we start to find limits on presidential power. And then finally, I'll end the course with a couple of cases on the First Amendment free speech clause. And so we will look at two early cases, and both decided in 1919 at the end of World War I. Schenck versus United States and Abrams versus United States. And these are the first two free speech cases that the US Supreme Court decides in its history. And then we'll skip to the early 1970s, Cohen versus California, which concerns the free speech clause and whether or not you have a fundamental right to use an infamous four-letter word. My students love to talk about that case. So a lot of things that we don't talk about, obviously. We don't have time to cover everything, to be sure. But I just wanted to give you a good idea about how this course works and to give you a good grounding in American constitutional law. Now, if you want to learn more about me, I'll spare the introductions, but you can go to the UWSP Political Science website and read up on me. You can read up on my colleagues too, and I'd encourage you to do that. You can certainly learn more about the political science department as well. So I look forward to continuing on with this. Thank you.